This is the recorded lecture for Chapter 7 on the skeleton. All right. Make sure for the skeletal system or the skeleton that you understand it is composed, we mostly think about the bones, and definitely that's what we're going to focus on. But don't forget that the bones also are attached to cartilage, or there's cartilage attached to the bones. And don't forget that the skeletal system consists of joints or articulations and ligaments and tendons as well. So we will talk about all of those. It says ligaments connect bones, but also make sure that you know tendons connect muscle to bone. Is he in the laundry? There's like 20 minutes left, I think, on the drive. And when y'all go down there, you can take this, so you don't have to haul it. You know. Okay. Did y'all have a good breakfast? Okay, the axial skeleton consists of 80 bones, and it's the skull, which includes the cranium and the cranial bones and the facial bones, and then the vertebral column or spine and the thoracic cage, which includes the ribs and the sternum. So these are the components of the axial skeleton, and the axial skeleton consists of 80 bones. All right, and you can see here it's in kind of a light green. That's the axial skeleton. And the rest of the skeleton is the appendicular skeleton, which I guess we'll talk about. We'll do the axial skeleton first. So the cranial bones or the cranium, those are the ones that enclose the brain. Okay, so that's going to include, let's see, I'm trying to find a picture that's got all of them. Okay, yeah, these are the cranial bones. The frontal bone is the forehead bone. The parietal bones are on the top of your head, but there's two of them. So there's a left and a right parietal bone. The occipital bone is in the back of your head. It articulates with your first two cervical vertebrae, the atlas and the axis. It actually articulates with the atlas. And when I say articulates with, that's just how, in anatomy, that's how we say that two bones come together at a joint. There are two temporal bones, left and right, near your, like kind of above your ears. There's a sphenoid bone and an ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone forms the roof of your orbit, I guess, of your forms the floor of the cranium, of the cranial cavity, forms the floor. And then there's the ethmoid bone, which is in the area of like your nasal cavity. So the cranium is the bones of the skull, and then the facial bones, that would be like the mandible and the maxilla and the zygomatic, so we'll go over those as well, but those are just the bones of the face. Sutures are the joints that hold the skull bones together, and they are fixed, they're interlocking, and no movement is permitted at sutures. So the coronal suture, you might recognize that it's if I made a cut here, it would be a coronal section, or a coronal plane. So here's the coronal suture. This one is the squamous suture, and then the one in the back is the lambdoid suture. The cavities in the cranial bones are called sinuses, or paranasal sinuses. Again, this is the list of the bones of the cranium. You can see the frontal bone here. You can see a little bit of the parietal bones, and you can see the temporal bones. You can't see the occipital bone from this view, but you can see all the others. And then the sphenoid bone, you can see part of it from through the eye sockets, and the ethmoid bone. So those two, just a little bit of the ethmoid bone, which is brown right here. But anyway, those two, the sphenoid and the ethmoid, are both bones of the skull. And then the rest of these, the nasal bone, the maxilla, the mandible, the zygomatic bones, these are, and then this one in here that's green, that's the lacrimal bone, the vomer, the, I said ethmoid already, so those are the facial bones. You can see a little bit better the sphenoid bone from this view, and you can see the ethmoid bone, part of it here from this view. The parietal bones, I just want you to be able to identify them, but know that the coronal suture separates the parietal and frontal bone. The sagittal suture separates in between the two parietal bones. The lambdoid suture is between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. And then the squamous suture is between the parietal and temporal bones. So all of these 4 sutures of the skull bones do have a connection with the parietal bones. You can see here the occipital bone in this posterior view. You can see the lambdoid suture. You can see the sagittal suture. And then in this view, you can see the coronal suture, and you can see the squamous suture. And the one you can't see is the sagittal, but it would be kind of up here at the top between the two parietal bones. And you can also see most of the bones of the skull and the cranial bones and the facial bones. So we'll just name them. This is the frontal bone, parietal, occipital, temporal, maxilla, zygomatic bone. This one here is a little bit that you can see of the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid, the lacrimal bone, the nasal bone, maxilla, mandible. There are 2 bone structures in the temporal bone I want you to be familiar with, actually 3. The external acoustic meatus is the canal, or it's a meatus, but it's a hole through your ear. And then this is the mastoid process, and the styloid process. And both of those are structures within the temporal bones. The occipital bone is in the back of the skull, and it contains a hole, a large hole. This word literally means large hole, the foramen magnum, and it is the hole through which the spinal cord passes through. And if I don't mention it, I mean, there's a lot of terms that we're passing over. If I don't say anything about it, I'm almost 100% for sure not going to ask you about it. All right, you can see the foramen magnum here in this view, and you can see the occipital bone with the foramen magnum, and this is the hole which the spinal cord passes through. All right, the temporal bones, make sure that you are familiar with the mastoid and styloid processes. They are attachments for several neck and tongue muscles. And make sure that you are familiar with the external acoustic meatus or external ear canal. The homeostatic imbalance tells us the mastoid process contains cavities or sinuses called mastoid air cells, and mastoiditis can develop if a middle ear infection spreads into the mastoid area. That's you may have heard before that you can have an infection, like an ear infection, and it can migrate to your bone. Well, this is one of the ways that happens. The mastoid air cells are separated from the brain by a very thin bony plate, and that increases the chances that the infection could spread to the brain. So it's very, very important to clear up an ear infection before it does get to the point where it will spread and cause brain damage and possibly even death. So the sphenoid bone is a bat-shaped bone. It's a keystone bone. It is the keystone bone. In other words, it articulates with all the other cranial bones. It comes into contact with all the other cranial bones, frontal, occipital, ethmoid, all of them, temporal, parietal, and then it does have the sphenoid. It does contain the sphenoidal sinuses, and it's not the same thing as what I just went over, the mastoid air cells, the mastoidal sinuses. That's within the mastoid process of the temporal bone. But the sphenoid bone contains the sphenoidal sinuses, which is just one example of the paranasal sinuses, and we're going to talk about all of those and where they're located. But another structure that I want you to know is the sella turcica within the sphenoid bone that houses the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland works together with the hypothalamus to produce hormones. So the sphenoid bone is the keystone bone that articulates with all the other cranial bones. The sphenoidal sinuses are a portion of the paranasal sinuses found within the sphenoid bone, and the sella turcica houses the pituitary gland. All right, the ethmoid bone basically does have these like protrusions or parts called the superior and middle nasal concha, and I can show you those. They're like little bulging areas of the ethmoid bone that bulge into the nasal cavity, and here they are. Okay, so this is the middle nasal concha, and it doesn't show the inferior. Inferior nasal concha here. Yeah, middle and inferior nasal concha. So the middle is formed by the ethmoid bone, and then the inferior is formed by, oh gosh, what is going to be the green bone? The inferior nasal concha. I believe it's formed by the lacrimal bone. But anyway, those concha within the nasal cavity, those like bulging areas that you see that protrude into the nasal cavity, what they do is when you breathe in, when you inhale through your nose, they cause the air to swirl around, and it helps to warm and humidify the air that comes in. And by doing that, you can actually take in a lot more oxygen. There are bones called sutural bones, which are little teeny tiny bones that appear within the sutures, like you see right here. And you're not going to have to identify those. The facial bones include the mandible or jawbone, the maxillary bones, which I call them the mustache bones because they're where a mustache would be. Zygomatic bones are the cheekbones. The nasal bones, of course, form the top part of the nose. Lacrimal bones are right there in the corner where, like, if you cried, your tears would run right there alongside where those lacrimal bones are located. The palatine bones and the vomer and the inferior nasal concha. Oh, that's why I couldn't find the bone that forms those, because they form their own. They are their own bone. Okay, mandible is the largest, strongest bone of the face. It is the lower jaw bone, and it does have alveolar processes that the teeth sit into. They're for the teeth. Then the maxillary bones. Let's see. Make sure that you know that some of the paranasal sinuses are found in the maxilla or maxillary bones. They're called maxillary sinuses. So we've named the sphenoidal sinuses and the maxillary sinuses. Then the zygomatic bones are the cheekbones. The nasal bones form the bridge of the nose, and they do attach to cartilage that forms the tip of your nose. The lacrimal bones do have a little structure that allows for the passageway for your tears to drain. And the palatine bones and the vomer, just make sure you can identify those. Okay, so the inferior nasal concha are bones that form one of the three pairs of concha. The ethmoid bone forms the other two pairs, the middle and the superior. And just remember that what they do is they cause the air to warm and humidify when you inhale. Okay, then there's the hyoid bone, which is not a skull bone, but it's the only bone in the body that does not articulate directly with any other bone, and it's anchored by ligaments. And it also, it's what gives rise to the Adam's apple, especially prominent in men. So that's the hyoid bone. The orbits or eye sockets are formed basically by the frontal bone, the zygomatic bone, and the maxilla. The nasal cavity, we've already gone over that. And then the paranasal sinuses real quick. The function of the nasal concha is to warm and humidify the air by causing the air to kind of swirl around when it enters your nasal cavity. But also the paranasal sinuses warm and humidify the air, and they help to lighten the skull. There are 5 skull bones that have paranasal sinuses, and they are the frontal, the sphenoid, and the ethmoid, and then it's really 4 bones. It's just that the maxillary bones, there's 2 of those. So it's frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and the maxillary bones. And here they are. You can see them in this illustration of her face. You've got the frontal sinuses, the ethmoidal sinuses, sphenoidal sinuses, and which are kind of, fused together with each other, and then the maxillary sinuses. Now, I'm going to stop the recording here, and we'll start the next recording with section 7.2 on the vertebral column, and that will be slide number 80. So we will stop with slide 79.